Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Here's the thing. If you're doing it right, if you follow Jesus, there's a good chance that at some point you're going to get yourself into a bit of trouble. Obviously, we'd rather not think about this aspect of things. We'd rather focus on how Jesus makes us a better person, which he does, or about how coming to church strengthens our ties to the community, which it does, or about how living God's way helps us to have better relationships with others, which it most certainly does. But I'll say it again, and our rather bizarre reading this morning makes it clear. If you're following Jesus, at some point, you're probably going to get yourself into a bit of trouble. It's rather odd that Mark takes so much time to tell this story. Many of Mark's stories happen in just a few verses. He's the king of immediately this and immediately that. This way of the evangelists telling most of the story doesn't take much time with the backstory or the details. But here, for this story, we get a whole 14 verses dedicated to just what happened to John the Baptist. And what can we learn from this story that Mark takes so much time to tell? Much of Mark's story is a story of the disciples trying again and often failing to understand just who this Jesus is and what it means to follow him. Even his own cousin, John, really doesn't understand at first just what Jesus is up to in the world. In another gospel, he has to send his disciples to say, "Are you the Messiah, or are we to wait for one who is to come?" But what they hear back is, "Yes, go back, tell what you hear, that the blind are made to see, the lame walk, those who have leprosy are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and good news is proclaimed to the poor." Even John eventually comes to understand that Jesus has come to usher in this new way of being, this new way of God ruling in the world. At some point, if you follow this strange God who is concerned with the exile, the defender of the poor and the brokenhearted, it's going to bring you out of line with those who are in power in our world, who rule differently now. Clearly, John has stepped on the wrong toes here. This King Herod that's mentioned is actually Herod Antipas. His wife Herodias had broken off her first marriage with his half-brother, seemingly for no better reason than just a whim. And Herod Antipas also had a first marriage that ended for no better reason. This second marriage between Herodias and Herod Antipas was blamed not just for a personal dispute, but for turning a territorial dispute into a full, blown-out war. It's not just a marriage dispute here, but it seems like Herod is looking for trouble on a grander scale. So again, what can we learn from John about the Christian life? First, as opposed to this terrible tetrarch, we're not called to go looking for trouble. John spent most of his life living out in the wilderness, surviving on a diet of locust protein bites and local farmers' market honey-sweetened smoothies. He was largely a hermit. He waited for people to come to him. The people who I've known, and maybe the people who you've known, have seemed like that. In their daily life, they seek to follow Jesus in peace and harmony with others. There's a great prayer in the Book of Common Prayer that shows this well. It goes, "Give us grace to be just and upright in all of our doings, quiet and peaceable, full of compassion, and ready to do good to all. We're not called to go looking for trouble, but we don't shy away from it either. John the Baptist spoke truth to power when it needed to be spoken. He spoke truth to Herod even when it was difficult. And Christians aren't called to shy away from speaking truth and love, even when it means that trouble might come to our front door. One of our sister ELCA churches that we mentioned in the prayers a couple of weeks ago, Bethlehem and Annandale, learned this lesson very recently. For years, they've been preaching a gospel that includes everyone. They have a welcome statement that goes like this: in response to God's overwhelming love, we stand in awe of the wideness of God's mercy. In faithfulness to the gospel of Jesus Christ, mindful of our Lutheran emphasis on grace, and rejoicing in the celebration of our shared baptismal journey, we welcome as members of our extended family all those who have ever felt excluded by the church because of their race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identification, age, physical or mental challenges, financial resources, or family status. They stand with their arms wide open, and yet trouble came to them. In the past 2 months, they've had their church broken into 8 times, had racial slurs scrawled on their walls. Most recently, every pew was slashed. And yet the council president continues to declare, "We won't let hate win." Their interim pastor said, "The Lutheran Church in general is very intentional about being welcoming, and it is sad that that may trouble some people. But what it does to us is energize us even more." They called a pastor who started the same week that this most recent vandalism happened. And he said, "I think that if there are crimes like this taking place, this church must be up to something good. Because this church is standing for a welcome in this community, and that's obviously upsetting somebody." That's the kind of radical love that can lead to trouble with the Salomes and the Herodians and the Herod Antipasses of this world. What else can we learn from our dear headless John? Discerning when to hold our ground and when to speak peace isn't always easy. The third thing we can learn is that having strong mentors to guide the way is absolutely essential. John was pretty lucky. He had the best mentor. He had Jesus himself. The rest of us have to be a little more intentional in seeking out Christ-like mentors. That's such an important piece of our youth ministry, that when our youth go out to serve, they also go out to get to know very good mentors, leaders, relationships who will provide a lifetime of guidance and a backboard to bounce off those hard middle school and high school problems that don't seem easily solved. We all need good mentors in our life. No matter what stage we're on, from the very beginning to the very end, we need people that we can look up to and know will respond to us in faith and in love. And fourth and finally, we also need people standing beside us. John and Jesus surrounded themselves with disciples. John's disciples show up at the end of this story as those who cared for John's body to the very end. Christian love happens together in community. Jesus said, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered, I am there with them." I've heard this quoted many times at the beginning of committee meetings where only 2 or 3 show up on a busy Tuesday night. I don't think that's quite exactly what Jesus was getting at. But I think what he was saying is that Christian love happens in those relationships, that we need other people. There, between people, God's love happens. Jesus shows up. The world has watched with bated breath for these past 2+ weeks as rescuers gathered from around the world to attempt to pull these 12 soccer players and their coach out from the caves in Thailand. I don't know how accurate this statistic is, but I read in one place that over 10,000 people were involved in some way with this rescue, providing meals or providing equipment, providing tents, places to stay for the volunteers, blankets, water pumps, on and on, much, much more. One man, Saman Gunman, gave his very life in attempting to set up the oxygen tanks along the way that the boys needed to be able to come back in safety. It's highly unlikely that any one of us will need 10,000 people to support us at any time, but we do need a few good people to surround us with love and kindness and inspiration to get through those days when we feel like we're at the bottom of a cave. What can we learn from John? Don't go looking for trouble, but don't shy away from it either in the name of Christ. Surround yourself with good mentors and good allies beside you. And when trouble is near, God will be closer. Amen.